Good morning, everyone. So what I'm going to try to do is integrate some basic background knowledge about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and what went wrong. A peace process that had great hopes, that had the attention of the entire international community, a huge amount of backing and financial support and political support from the entire world, built on the right theories. People who actually were engaged in negotiations had all studied the mediation classes and had studied Roger Fisher and getting to yes and getting past no and knew all the stuff, and yet the process failed into disaster. So, and of course, it's not a dead issue. It's out there. A new administration in Washington, Secretary of State Kerry is on his way to the region to try and restart negotiations again. And I always say, when we're looking at this and the process has failed, and so many people attack the idea of even beginning again because it was so tragic the first time around, there's a built-in assumption for people looking at this issue, perhaps other conflicts as well, and making the automatic assumption that what went wrong before is going to go wrong again. In other words, there's some kind of condemnation that we're doomed to make the same mistakes over and over again. And I contend, as someone who's studied the conflict, someone who's been working on the conflict, someone who's been a negotiator in the conflict, we actually have the ability to make new mistakes. And I'm an advocate of making new mistakes, not the old mistakes. We will always make mistakes. We have to learn from those errors, but we don't have to make the same mistakes twice. So we're going to do a very quick overview. This presentation could actually be taught throughout a whole semester, and we have less than an hour to do it. So we're going to zip through. The initial thinking, like in most conflict situations, is get to a situation of complete lack of symmetry between a strong power and a weak power, and develop a methodology that enables both sides to come out as winners. That's what you want. People to leave the table with a sense that they've gained more, the win-win strategy, so that everyone knows that they have something to lose if it fails. But we had a classic situation in Israel and Palestine where the process went from win-win to lose-lose. And the amazing thing is that both sides were willing to pay the price to lose. Not only were they willing to turn it from a win-win to a lose-lose, when the conflict re-emerged and the peace process failed, each side struggled so that the losses would be greater on the other side. It wasn't just important to them that the other side lose. We had to help them lose bigger. The bigger loser, it became the struggle. So, Israel and Palestine signed 6 agreements over the course of 6 years. Official agreements signed by the government of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization representing the Palestinian people. The aim of these agreements was to create a process that would enable them to negotiate peace. A lot of people think that the Oslo peace process was an Oslo peace agreement. It was not. The Israelis and Palestinians did not get to sign a peace agreement. They signed agreements that designed a process that would enable them to confront the difficult issues between them. And a process was necessary because we went from a period of mutual non-recognition. Neither the Israelis represented the Palestinian people and their rights for a state, nor did the Palestinian people represent the Jewish people and the right of the state of Israel to exist as a Jewish nation state. So we went from a period of non-mutual recognition to the first breakthrough was mutual recognition, at least in part. The first Oslo agreement, which is called the Declaration of Principles, included an exchange of letters between the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, and the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, in which Yasser Arafat said to Yitzhak Rabin, we, the Palestinian people, the representatives of the Palestinian people, recognize Israel's right to exist. Problem number one in this process was that the letter that Arafat got in exchange from Rabin for that recognition of Israel's right to exist was not a letter of Israel recognizing the Palestinian people's right to exist as a nation, as a state. The letter was a recognition of the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. So here we have the first imbalance in a structure which is made to take a conflict which is deeply asymmetrical and to create a more level field, so when they're sitting at the negotiating table, they're playing on an equal field. But here from the outset, the very first exchange of letters that took place recognized the state and recognized an organization, not the same thing. And I would say that problem number one in this process began on that very first day of the signing. The second thing is that the Declaration of Principles, the first agreement that was signed with a big hoo-ha on the White House lawn in September of 1993 with the famous handshake between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, was an interim process. It was an agreement for a 5-year period, during which time Israel would withdraw from territories, Palestinians would take control of territories, establish their representative government, have elections, and create a Palestinian ruling authority. But this was only on an interim basis. The hardcore issues that needed to be negotiated for peace were set out and defined within that agreement, but there was no agreement on those issues. That was borders, statehood, Jerusalem, refugees. The hardcore issues were left to be built-in part of the process. So we moved forward. We ended a period of violence in which we said we were going to resolve all of our differences through negotiations, no longer through violence. So this mechanism was created to build a Palestinian Authority to enable Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories and to have a process of continued negotiations. Each one of these agreements signed was meant to advance the process forward. By the time we got to here in 1998, we had an agreement was to fix some of the agreements that were made in the past. Agreements had been breached. We needed to come back to the table and renegotiate in order to fix the breaches. And the same thing with the Sharm el-Sheikh Memorandum at the end of, in September 99. Those last two agreements were not initially part of the process. They were Band-Aids put on to heal the wounds that had already opened up when the process began failing. We'll get into the reasons why that happened. The aim of the negotiations, as I said, was to create a process where they could negotiate. I'm going to zip through this. We don't really have a lot of time for this. It was understood that the initial agreements were interim periods. It was based on a legal structure backed by the United Nations. This was important to give the whole process. An international conflict resolution process had to be based on international legitimacy and international law. So it was based on UN security resolutions, which gave it a framework of international law. It was not taking place outside of international law. It was within a framework that the international community had designated as a basis for negotiations. And this was important because it had to have the support of the international community in order to move forward as well. A transition period. These were the different agreements. The Oslo Agreement was an agreement of cooperation. The idea, and I'm sure you've learned this in mediation, when you make an agreement, the agreement between the disputing parties is important to end the agreement, but the essential value of a mediated agreement is building a new relationship. The focus is not on the text of the agreement itself. The agreement is a tool. You want to use a tool in a mediated agreement to create a new structure for a new relationship. The importance is what comes after the agreement and not before. All too often we get bogged down in the negotiations and fight over every word. And I've always heard from mediators, and I know this for myself, that when you have an agreement, the agreement is successful. You know the agreement is successful by how little you refer to it afterwards. When you're negotiating an agreement, every word is important. Every T that you cross, every I that you dot is essential. You'll argue over every comma and every text and every term in the document itself. A mediated agreement which is successful is one that will get put in the drawer, and you won't refer to it very many times over the first year. You pull it out several times to look at what did we agree on. By year 2, year 3 down the road, it's completely a document of history. That's the key of whether or not a mediated agreement is successful. What you want to do is build a new relationship which creates trust between the parties so that they don't have to go back to a mediator every time they have a dispute between them. They already have the ability to resolve those ongoing conflicts on their own. Now, conflict, I'm sure you probably learned, one of the first classes I took in mediation was a whole discussion on what is conflict. Conflict is good. Conflict is not bad. Conflict is a way of shaping and moving relationships forward. Conflicts emerge all the time. We encounter conflicts every day of our lives. And when you're in a conflict situation, you're not going to put an end to conflicts for all times. What you're going to do is teach the combating partners in a conflict how to deal with the conflict in a way that doesn't bring about violence. So the Oslo Agreement was aimed at creating a relationship between enemies who had been killing each other for 100 years into a relationship where they could work together, cooperate across boundaries, learn from each other, share information and knowledge, and build this win-win. So the Oslo Agreement actually, in its conception, created 26 different joint committees between Israel and the Palestinians in tourism and archaeology and economics and plant protection and environment and in water and in science and in academia, in education, you name it. 26 joint committees were created as a result of this process. These are some of those committees that were created. Joint security committees with multiple levels of joint security cooperation. Economic committees, subcommittees on transportation, petroleum, VAT taxation, veterinary, plant protection, dairies, tourism, everything. All these environment committees were consolidated to be more effective, and regional and district offices were set up for the parties to work together. It was actually a brilliant process. But if you sat down and looked at the agreements and analyzed them and saw what the thinking was behind how do you build partnerships at a point when there was conflict, this is the way to do it. You take the issues that are mutual concern, that are cross-boundary, you create mechanisms for the parties to work together. And hopefully that would build trust. And the idea was actually that once we're working together, once we're doing all this cooperation together, once we're building trust with each other, we'll then have enough confidence to deal with the hard issues, like delineation of borders, like the future of Jerusalem, like the issue of refugees. Those are the core issues that are really difficult, but at the beginning of the process, people thought we're not mature enough, we're not ready enough, we don't trust enough in order to address those issues. So they built this process in it. The international community added another layer to the process. They said it's not enough for Israel and Palestine to be doing this. We have to have the whole region involved. So they created a multilateral process that brought together all the countries of the Middle East and all the countries of the world that wanted to contribute to it. And they created 5 multilateral working groups on water, in refugees, environment, regional economic development, and arms control and regional security. And 2 countries were given the chairmanship of each one of these communities, and they were the committees, and they were the conveners, and tens of countries around the world were engaged in this process that was supposed to supplement the bilateral Israeli-Palestinian peace process by supporting it globally from the rest of the region. What went wrong? There have been numerous papers and books written about what went wrong, which we ended up calling WWW in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. There were unexpected things. Our prime minister, the Israeli prime minister, was assassinated by an Israeli who was opposed to the peace process. A religious right-wing Israeli who, on an evening following a peace demonstration in Tel Aviv, managed to get up to the prime minister and shot him with 3 bullets in the back and killed the prime minister, who led this peace process, who built the relationship with Yasser Arafat, who was dedicated to leading Israel to a new future. He was not only a great leader for the state of Israel, he came from the military. His whole background, his whole life was a soldier. And here you had a soldier, the one who was the chief of staff in the 1967 Six Days War, a hero of Israel, becoming the person who's leading the peace in Israel. This was enormously significant for changing Israeli public opinion. If Mr. Rabin, Mr. Security, Mr. Army is the person who's leading us to peace, then it has to be good. We have to trust him. But he was assassinated. I remember coming home from the demonstration in which he was killed in Tel Aviv, driving toward Jerusalem and hearing the announcement on the radio that Rabin was killed. I felt at that moment that the people who killed him killed the peace process that night. And no one but Rabin, or almost no one but Rabin, was in the position to be able to lead Israel forward through the difficult decisions that he'd had to make with his courage and his determination. So that was an unexpected and unplanned for blow to the peace process. Something that also emerged was we ended up going back to violence. We had spoilers on the Israeli side who protested against the prime minister and killed the prime minister. On the Palestinian side, there were spoilers radicals who were opposed to the process, who were opposed to Palestinians compromising, who breached the fundamental principle of the peace process, which was resolving disputes at the table, and went back to violence, went back to using terrorism. And we had a wave of terrorist bombings in Israel, which killed Israelis on buses, mostly, and created more objection in Israel to deal with the process. Now, while Rabin was alive, he had made a statement that guided him in dealing with this problem of the continuation of terrorism. What Rabin said is, we're going to fight terrorism as if there's no peace process, and we're going to move forward with the peace process as if there's no terrorism. After Rabin was killed, there was no one in Israel in a position who could stand up and say that. As Palestinian terrorism increased and more Israelis were getting killed, there was more opposition to the peace process inside of Israel. One of the political candidates running for office at the time after Rabin's assassination said, "We've had enough casualties of peace." And that became a mantra, and it became a myth. But in reality, the people who were killed were not casualties of peace. They weren't casualties, there was no peace. They were casualties of the ongoing conflict. But what happened in Israeli society, and very much in Palestinian society as well, is that peace became a four-letter word. Peace was something bad, we don't want it. If this is peace, we don't want it. There was a bumper sticker that said that. There was a bumper sticker that said, those responsible for Oslo, for the Oslo peace process, should be brought to justice, meaning that those who brought us this peace process are criminals. And this was the attitude that was developing in Israeli society as we had spoilers resorting to violence and killing people because they were afraid of concessions. And at the end of this period of increased violence, the leader of the right-wing camp in Israel who was opposed to the peace process was elected. That was the public atmosphere that was created that enabled the opposition to the peace process to be elected. Netanyahu, who's again our prime minister, just elected now for a third time. Unfortunately, we don't have term limitations of 2 terms like you guys have, so we can have someone in office for a very long time. So more lessons learned. The process, as I said, laid out a 5-year interim period to address the core issues in the conflict. And the idea, as I said, was to create trust. But what happened as the interim period went on and got extended and we weren't resolving the core issues, people were having a sense that we were giving away valuable assets that were on the negotiating table without getting the returns that were necessary in resolving the conflict. It was a 5-year interim period. The agreement said that the permanent status negotiations, the negotiations on the core issues, had to begin by the end of the 3rd year. And they had to be concluded by the end of the 5th year. That's what the agreement said. I had once spoken to Prime Minister Rabin and I said, it's true that the agreement obligates you to begin those negotiations by the end of the 3rd year, but it doesn't say that you can't begin it now. Why wait? My sense was that if you have a long-term interim period with all of its good ideas behind it, but in that interim period, you're not addressing the core issues in the conflict, the issues that really make people angry, that are really of concern to people, and you keep postponing them, then you're creating more opposition to the process itself. If you have issues that are on the table and they're burning, my philosophy in negotiations is to bring those issues up as soon as possible. There's a mantra, there's a general truism in our peace process that the core issue which is most difficult is Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem is not only an urban city, it's a holy city. And it's the holiest city to the Jewish people, the 3rd holiest people to Muslims. It's a core issue which is if you could deal with it at the level of urban space, it's resolvable, because then you're dealing with infrastructure and roads and traffic and economic development. But the minute you put on this extra level of spirituality, of what we call heavenly Jerusalem, it becomes very complex because it's very difficult to negotiate non-negotiables. Irrational attachments are non-negotiables. And people have irrational attachments to symbols. You can't negotiate symbols. My belief was that Jerusalem should be the first issue on the table. Is what I've always advocated. Let's deal with the hardest issue first. Because if we could succeed in finding solutions and answers for in Jerusalem, we have to crack our heads together and work on it to produce solutions. Everything else will fall into place. But if you keep the most difficult issue till the end of the process with the hope that you're going to build up agreements to get to it, what essentially is happening in those negotiations, from my experience, is everyone's thinking about the end game anyway. You're always focused on the end game. So as much as possible, I believe you should bring the end game forward, not leave it to the end of the table, to the end of the road. Dates are holy. You sign an agreement. The agreement has dates by which time something's supposed to happen. In the Israeli-Palestinian process, we had set dates of when we were supposed to move from phase to phase. When we got to those dates, they were breached. They were not implemented. And then we got into a problem because we signed an agreement and it wasn't implemented. We have breaches. People lose faith in the process. What value does signing of an agreement have if what you agree on you don't do? But it turns out that dates are important because certain things are supposed to happen by those dates. But what if they don't happen? What if, for example, as we had, there was supposed to be a Palestinian commitment to fight terrorism in an area which Israel was going to withdraw from, but they had not met their commitment. They did not dismantle terrorist cells, they did not capture weapons that were in the public, they did not establish a command center, they did not build the cooperative security apparatus that was supposed to be developed. And you get to the date when Israel is supposed to withdraw. Should Israel withdraw and leave the situation in chaos? Well, they obviously didn't at that time, and then the Palestinians said, you're not honoring the agreement. So these are very difficult issues, and you need to find a balance and a way to mitigate both this issue of progress, of benchmarks, of performance, and dates. The only way to deal with that, I think, or one of the, well, not the only way, but probably the best way to deal with that is what I'll talk about soon as well, is the entrance and introduction of trusted third parties who are serving as monitors and judges. If the decisions on progress are left to the parties themselves, then you're doomed to have arguments. Who met their responsibilities, who met their obligations, and who didn't, it's going to turn into mutual accusations of failure. That's why it's necessary from the outset of these kind of processes that are ongoing continuum conflicts to have an agreed upon third party, a monitor, a judge, who is on the ground with a team. We're not talking about one individual who's serving God, but actually an apparatus that's in place to continue to observe, to facilitate, to mediate, to monitor, and to make judgments when the day is necessary to make those judgments. It's not in the hands of the parties themselves, because that's just a recipe for more conflict. This is what I was saying, the external mechanisms for ensuring implementation. Now, the other thing that's necessary, you have to assume in these protracted conflicts that are very complex, that even after you have agreements, disputes are going to arise. They're going to be there. It's a natural part of the process. You need a mechanism built in to resolve those disputes at the lowest levels possible on an ongoing basis. In our conflict, we didn't have that. So if some Palestinian official riding in his car encountered an Israeli military checkpoint and got into an argument at that checkpoint with the sergeant, and the Palestinian official says, I have a pass that allows me to move without being checked, and the sergeant at the checkpoint says, no, I have a responsibility to check everyone who passes this checkpoint. But there's an agreement between the sides that Palestinian officials don't get checked at Israeli checkpoints, and a dispute develops between them that could go into violence, or it could go with the Palestinian official going home when he was supposed to meet an Israeli official. And this turns into a major international dispute that requires the intervention of the Prime Minister and the President of the Palestinian Authority, and sometimes even the President of the United States. Can you imagine that? A dispute at a checkpoint that gets to the desk of the President of the United States. That's absurd. But it happened. It happened because there was no mechanism to deal with disputes at the ground level, in real time. It's not enough to negotiate an agreement and sign a piece of paper and then go home, I did my work. Conflict continues and disputes emerge, and you have to build in, as part of the agreements, not an afterthought. You have to assume that when you are negotiating an agreement, that these are going to continue to require intervention in the future. An agreed mechanism for resolving disputes has to be part of the agreement. Talked about this already. Another thing that's important is, particularly when you're dealing with multinational disputes on territorial issues, maps are really important. This may sound stupid or obvious, but for years, Israelis and Palestinians have been arguing about the size and shape of the Palestinian state. And we talk about percentages here and percentages there, and we're going to withdraw from this amount of kilometers and that amount of kilometers. It doesn't mean anything until you open the map and start drawing lines on the map. Because it's the reality on the ground that changes. But we've been going on arguing amongst Israelis and Palestinians about withdrawals from 2%, from 3%, from 4%, until you pull out the map and have an agreed upon map. It doesn't mean anything. Here's a great, true story. The last round of negotiations that took place between Israel and the Palestinians was between the past Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and President Mahmoud Abbas. And they had met together in 40 private sessions. The negotiations had advanced enormously. In the last round of negotiations, Mr. Olmert pulled out a map that he presented to President Abbas and said, "This is our proposal for the Israeli withdrawals and for the transfer of territories from Israel to Palestine to compensate for land that we want to annex, to accommodate settlers who are living in the Palestinian areas." And they looked at the map together and they studied it together, and Mahmoud Abbas asked questions about different areas and took notes for himself. And when the meeting ended, he asked to take the map with him, and Olmert said no. He wouldn't give him the map. And when Mahmoud Abbas went back to Ramallah to his office to do a debriefing with the session, his team obviously asked him about a map. And he took out a piece of paper from his desk and he drew a map from what he remembered that he saw on the piece of paper. That is not a proper way to negotiate. Maps are important, details are essential, things have to be put in writing. You can talk about principles, you can begin discussions about principles. I know from my experience, in most conflict situations, the people with the power usually want to deal with details, the people without the power want to deal with principles. So negotiations will almost always begin with dealing with principles. These are the principles of the resolution of the conflict. International law, what are our rights? And a classic example is when Israelis and Palestinians negotiated water. Israel controls the water, Palestinians want the water. Palestinians will say, "We want you to recognize our water rights." And the Israeli answer to that would be, "How much water do you need?" The Israelis wanted to deal with the details. The Palestinians wanted to establish the principles. This is the way it goes in negotiations. At the end of the day, after you've established the principles, you have to get into the details. The details have to give the meat to the principles that you're setting, and it all has to be put down on paper, on documents that you can exchange and share. Agreements have to be explicit. It bewilders me and amazes almost everyone that in the 6 Israeli-Palestinian agreements that were signed, it doesn't say any place in those agreements that Israel cannot continue to build settlements. Settlements are continued, building in occupied areas is considered in violation of international law. Nonetheless, Israel does not observe or validate that part of international law and believes that the territory that it occupied, that it conquered in 1967 after being attacked, is legitimately Israeli territory. Historically, it's Jewish land, the land of the prophets, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. We have a historical attachment to that land. It's in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that this is the land that God gave to us. The places there, even the Palestinian villages, are actually named for places that appear in the Bible as Hebrew names. So we believe it's our birthright to have that land, and we believe we have the right to settle. I'm saying we, the state of Israel, believes that it has the right to settle there. Palestinians have seen the settlements as a violation of international law, something which is predetermining the outcome of negotiations, creating facts on the ground, preventing the creation of the Palestinian state. That's their position. The position of the United States has been always that settlements are an obstacle to peace. How is it possible that 6 agreements were signed, and in nowhere in those agreements it says that Israel has to stop building settlements? It's amazing. So Israel kept building settlements. What the agreements did say is that neither side will do anything that will prejudge the outcome of the permanent status negotiations. Palestinians interpret that to mean that Israel will stop building settlements. The Israelis said, building a settlement doesn't prejudge the termination of the outcome of the permanent status negotiations, because we could build a community and then withdraw from it. It becomes Palestinian afterwards. But the Palestinians knew every time Israelis built a new community, built new houses, that became the new map of the area that they wanted to annex. So it's essential, particularly on issues that are important to you, that they are explicitly spelled out in those agreements. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, during the Nixon era, who was an extremely good negotiator, created something called shuttle diplomacy, negotiated a separation of forces agreement between Israel and Syria in 1974, an agreement that's held, the longest agreement in the Middle East that's held to the word by both parties, this separation of agreement. Kissinger was an advocate. In fact, he invented the concept that he called constructive ambiguity. Taking something which is in dispute, making it, putting enough ambiguity into it so that both sides can claim to understand from it what they want. That was Kissinger's magic. This idea of writing in the agreement that sides will not do things that will prejudge the outcome of the permanent status negotiations was constructive ambiguity that was bad. Because in the ability for each side to understand it as it want, it continued to put into this process on the land the most difficult obstacle toward the future of negotiations. So there are times when perhaps constructive ambiguity is warranted, and there are times when it's absolutely horrible, destructive to the process. Well, you need to think about the outcome of any constructive ambiguity and determine where explicitity is more important than ambiguity. We talked a little bit about violence already. What do you do when you have this process that's going on, a peace process, and it happens anywhere there's a peace process going on? You have elements that resort to violence, and the violence threatens the agreement. How do you deal with that? How do the leaders deal with it? How do they face their people? I don't have clear answers to that. I just know that it has to be addressed. You can't push it off the table and say that violence is happening and we're just going to move forward. There has to be a commitment by both parties in a violent conflict that violence cannot be tolerated. And when the violence erupts, it's primarily the responsibility of the party from which the violence is coming from to deal with it. This was in the Israeli-Palestinian process when the Palestinian side failed to address the violence that was emerging within its own society against Israel. Israel went in and dealt with it. And when Israel deals with Palestinian violence, they go in and they kill people. And when they kill people, you breed more hatred. You create the next generation of hatred. You create the next generation of people who are committed to continuing the conflict. You create the sense of desire for revenge. You need to have the situations dealt with in which each society is dealing with the spoilers and the violence from within. And that has to be part of the understanding of the process. And if the parties need support and help from the outside to do it, then it has to be talked about at the table together. The more that the two parties can share the difficulties that they're having in dealing with the violence and the spoilers from within their own party, the better result they will get together working to end that violence. But it can't be ignored, and it can't become the launching pad for the destroying of the peace process. That's what usually happens. How much do you involve the public? These kind of negotiations can only be done in closed rooms. When the Israeli-Palestinian peace process has become public diplomacy, each party ends up negotiating with its own public and not with the people in the room. But if you alienate the people from the process, why should they support it afterwards? They were left out. They didn't know what kind of compromises you're going to make. Maybe the compromises you had to make are such that the public is against them. So where do you find the balance between the need to inform the public, to educate the public, to convince the public that what you're doing is right, and also the need to have a negotiation which is going to be successful? There will be no successful Israeli-Palestinian negotiated agreement in the future if it's public diplomacy. I'm 100% sure of that. I also believe very strongly that when we reach an agreement, the Israelis and Palestinians, on peace, and we go to both publics, we'll have support. Now, why do I believe that? Because so much work was done over the past 20 years, mainly by civil society in Israel and in Palestine, in creating constituencies for peace. So here we found the balance by engaging civil society in bringing Israelis and Palestinians together, in talking about the kind of agreements that need to be made, on working on agreements, and getting Israelis and Palestinians to sit down to the table and conduct mock negotiations, of producing an organization, a joint Israeli-Palestinian organization, that produced a deep, detailed, full, comprehensive agreement, several hundred pages, that was led by former negotiators, people who are not in government now, including a former chief of staff of the Israeli army who got engaged in this, and this became public. And this was part of educating the public to get them ready to make the kind of compromises that are necessary when the day will come. But this also has to be in your thinking, in your planning, as you're moving peace processes forward, engaging the public. There are two basic styles of negotiations. There's what we call the Middle East Bazaar, sometimes called the zero-sum negotiation, a winner and a loser, person who holds assets and gives them away. The Middle East Bazaar is you go in and you see a really nice scarf that you want to buy, and the guy who's selling it offers you to sell it to you for $100, and you want to pay $20 for it. He's willing to take $40, but he's not going to tell you that. You're willing to pay $40, but you're not willing to tell him that either. So you have this negotiation. If he says 100, and you say 10, and he says 90, and you say 15, and you go down until you find some agreeable middle point. That's usually the way negotiations work out. It's the most inefficient way of negotiating. It more often than not produces agreements that both parties are not really pleased with. You walk out of the store saying, I paid too much. He walks back into the store saying, I could have gotten more. No one's really happy with it. The other style of negotiation is the cooperative negotiation, where you put your cards on the table. This is my situation. These are my red lines. This is as far as I can go. And the other side does the same thing. And the more that you can get to a negotiation where you're sharing what your real positions are, the more likely it is that you're going to find areas of agreement that are not only limited to the particular issue that you're dealing with, but you'll also find trade-offs. This is a classic cooperative negotiation where it turns out that there are some issues that are important to me and some issues that are less important to me. There are some issues that are more important to you and less important to you. And there are often trade-offs that you can give me something which is more important to me than what it is to you, and I can give you something more important to you. Let me give you an example. In the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, they were negotiating the size of the Palestinian Legislative Council. Israel didn't care. It didn't matter if it was 50 or 100 or 200. It was irrelevant to the Israeli side. But they didn't tell this to the Palestinians. They made it into a negotiating issue because the Israelis wanted to get concessions from Palestinians on other issues. I don't remember exactly which issue it was they wanted to get concessions from. But they played out this issue of getting the Palestinians to beg to enlarge the size of the council when it was absolutely unimportant to Israel how big the council was. Now, maybe Israel thought it won a victory because it got concessions from the Palestinians on another issue that they wanted. But had they played it differently and said, listen, we don't care about the size of the council. You tell us what size council you want. It's okay with us. But what's really important to us is something else that's important to you. Let's see if we can agree to a deal. That's a negotiation that creates an entirely different atmosphere in enabling progress. When you begin to build trust because you're not hiding your assets. You're not hiding what you're controlling. You're actually putting on the table and saying, our problem is X. Let's try and solve that problem together. This is as far as I can go. I can't go further for different reasons, and I can explain it. But the more your negotiating style is open, cooperative, and honest, in my view, the result will be better. Because again, the result is not only the piece of paper you're going to sign. The main result is the relationship that comes after you sign the agreement. That has to be your focus, looking into the future. Democracy, democratic institution building is essential. This is something that I've long believed in. It's been documented in history. Democratic nations usually don't go to war with each other. It just works that way. If you're a democratic country and your leadership is accountable to its people, the chances of that country going to war against another democracy are very small. Some people think it's much easier to negotiate with a dictator. One person to negotiate with, they have a lot of power, they can impose their will. The United States' foreign policy has been based on having relationships with dictators for years. So much easier to manage international relations when you can deal with a friendly dictator. Supply them with money, supply them with weapons, they give you their oil, etc. It's great. But it doesn't sustain peace. Because peace cannot only be between leaders, it has to be between peoples and societies. And if you want to build peace which is lasting, democracy is important. You can't overlook democracy and the need to work for democratic institution building and for real democracy based on the values of democracy and not just the tools of democracy. George W. Bush's thing was elections. Let's have elections. Countries will be democratic when they have elections. Well, you can elect very non-democratic governments through elections, and you can have very non-democratic regimes that hold elections. You need the basis of democracy, which are the values of democracy, which are the systems of democracy that protect human rights, the rights of minorities, the rights of women, the rights of freedom of expression and freedom of the press and freedom of prayer and religion, etc. Those are the bases of freedom and democracy, and these things are essential to build into peace processes as well. It's really important. You can negotiate peace treaties with non-democratic societies, but they will be much more sustainable over time and help the people that you're trying to reach out to in a much deeper way if you can also build in democracy into those processes. Peace has to pay. Economically, people's lives have to improve as a result of peace. If people's lives get more difficult as a result of peace, they don't want it. In the Oslo peace process, Israel profited greatly by entering into the process. The whole world opened up to Israel. Everyone wanted to come and invest in Israel. The level of foreign investment in Israel zoomed. The per capita income in Israel increased enormously after Israel entered in peace. On the Palestinian side, their economy got worse. Before the peace process began, Palestinians had free movement. There were no checkpoints, there were no walls, there were no fences. Palestinians from the occupied territory could get in their car and travel into Tel Aviv, move into Israel, work in Israel, from Gaza go to Tel Aviv. It was open. Suddenly you have a peace process and we have borders. And around those borders fences were put and walls were put and checkpoints were put. And all of a sudden Palestinians needed permits to enter Israel, to work in Israel. So the Palestinian public said, hold on, what's going on here? Peace is supposed to pay. The amount of money I could work as a laborer inside of Israel is double the amount of money I can make inside of Palestine. I want to continue working in Israel, but now I have a border. I have to get a permit. I have to have an agreement that they're going to pay taxes on me and all kinds of other limitations. And peace didn't pay economically for the Palestinian side. And you would end up creating more and more difficulties amongst Palestinians who said, what's going on here? We're supposed to prosper. We're supposed to have a better life as a result of this process. So this has to be calculated in as well. You have to think about what's the outcome and the impact of this process on the people who are living it. And if it doesn't end up paying, it's not going to be accepted. Mediators have to be prepared to step in and play a bridging role when required. During the Camp David negotiations under Bill Clinton with Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak, the American team at Camp David had prepared bridging proposals. They knew that there were going to be difficulties between the Israelis and the Palestinians in negotiating all the positions, and Clinton and his team had prepared documents to put down on the table. But at Camp David, the Israeli Prime Minister convinced the chief American negotiator, Dennis Ross, not to do it, because the American proposals were too close to the Palestinian proposals. In other words, the American proposal was going to put more pressure on Israel than on the Palestinians, and the Israeli side, who were closer allies to the American administration than the Palestinian side, convinced the Americans not to table their bridging proposals at Camp David. And after Camp David in July 2000, the parties went back home and a new round of violence broke out in September, the Second Intifada. In the beginning of the Second Intifada, before Clinton left office in December of 2000, a month before he finished his terms of office, he called the parties together and he put down his bridging proposal called the Clinton Parameters. And the Clinton Parameters was a guideline for how he thought the Israelis and the Palestinians should resolve all the issues in conflict. A map for a resolution. And both sides accepted the Clinton proposals. But it was too late by then. The violence had emerged. Already more than 100 people had been killed, several hundred people had been killed. The violence was raging, terrorism was beginning. We went to new elections in Israel, and we re-elected in Israel as a result of the violence that emerged following the negotiations, the most right-wing extreme prime minister, Ariel Sharon, who was not interested in continuing the peace process, and he ended up attacking the Palestinians, destroying their infrastructure, locking up Yasser Arafat in his headquarters in Ramallah, and that was the end of the peace process. If Bill Clinton and his team had tabled their compromise positions, their bridging proposals in Camp David in July of 2000, we would have probably had an entirely different situation. So if you're a mediator, and you're an accepted mediator, do the job. Work with the sides in building the bridging proposals and stand behind them and put them on the table and offer your advice to work with the sides in doing that. We had all these joint committees and commissions that were developed as a result of Oslo. When the process got into trouble and there were breaches, all the joint committees collapsed. All the work that was aimed at building trust between the parties simply stopped. The Israelis and the Palestinians stopped convening the meetings of the joint working committees. One of the joint working committees, it was an environmental scientists committee. The heads of the committee were people I was working with in an environmental project. I was running an NGO, a joint Israeli-Palestinian NGO. And they came to me and said, Gershom, we need your help. We have this scientific environmental committee. We're working on some really important issues. We're not allowed to meet. Can you convene us? And we created a framework that we called Unofficial Meetings of Officials. And we went to Turkey. We took the group of Israeli and Palestinian environmental scientists to Turkey. For a weekend, we began a process of running unofficial meetings of officials. They needed help. We were a third party who could assist them. One of the most important committees that was developed was a joint water committee. Water is life. You can't live without water. The American government understood that if all the committees collapse, the one committee which cannot collapse is the Joint Water Committee. So the Americans had an official in the embassy in Tel Aviv, a brilliant man who was a water expert working for US Aid, who decided that he was going to transform the Israeli-Palestinian Joint Water Committee into a trilateral committee, American, Israeli, and Palestinian. And he sent out invitations to the committee heads. He set the agenda. He kept the protocol of the meetings. He ran this process and transformed the joint Israeli-Palestinian Water Committee into a trilateral American Israeli-Palestinian Water Committee. And during the Second Intifada, got these two warring parties to sign agreements that water would be left out of the fighting. No one will attack water installations. No one will damage water pipes. And even when Yasser Arafat was under siege in Ramallah, an Israeli tank rode over a water main, a pipe, in the center of Ramallah. And while the Israelis and the Palestinians were shooting at each other, the Ramallah water workers came out to fix the water pipe because it was part of the agreement that water will be left out of the conflict. It's like a bizarre, unreal, Twilight Zone situation that here the tanks are moving in, the Israelis and the Palestinians are shooting at each other, and Palestinian water workers are fixing a water pipe in the middle of the city under American protection. Cooperation in conflict situations needs assistance. You can't just leave it to the parties to fix whatever's going on by themselves. They need help. Processes need to be civilized. In other words, taken out of the hands of the military. In most conflict situations between states or states and non-state actors, the negotiators, the implementers, the people with influence come from the military. They want to run the show. When Yitzhak Rabin started working on the peace process, he went to his chief of staff of the army and he said, "General, I need you to form a team of people to advise me on the peace process." We had a brilliant chief of staff then who said to the Prime Minister, "Mr. Barak, I'm really sorry, I'd like to help you, but we don't know how to do that. You want us to prepare for the next war? We're really good at doing that. Making peace? We have no experience in doing that. We're the army." So when you have honest people in the army who will tell you that, that's great. And then Rabin went and formed a team of experts to help him negotiate with the Palestinians. But in most cases, you have the military coming in, being the negotiators, sitting at the table. I participated in a meeting they brought together in the Israeli Ministry of Finance to prepare a trilateral working meeting with the Secretary, our parallel to the Secretary of the Treasury of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And we had a discussion of about 30 people in the room about what should be accomplished at that meeting. I almost fell off my seat when at the end of the meeting, one of the military people who were sitting in the room, who didn't participate in the discussion, got up to summarize the discussion. So what's going on here? This was a discussion of a meeting to take place between the ministers of finance, and some guy from the military is summarizing the meeting? Peace processes cannot be run by the military. The military's job is to provide the mechanisms for security, for dealing with the security cooperation, with fighting against terrorism. But peace processes have to be turned over to the civilian officials who are responsible for them. And the sooner, the faster, and the more efficiently you can get the military people out of the process, the more likely you'll have a successful process. In our part of the world, both the Palestinian military people and the Israeli military people continue to run the show for too long. And they have a different mentality in dealing with conflict. Personal relationships are really important, can't be replaced. The chemistry between negotiators, the chemistry between leaders is sometimes even more important than what's being negotiated. We had joint military patrols. Israelis and Palestinians patrolling areas together with an Israeli jeep, a Palestinian jeep. When they were going through an Israeli-controlled area, the Israeli jeep would be forward, the Palestinian jeep would be behind it. When they moved into Palestinian-controlled areas, they would change roles. They would sit together and talk to each other and learn about each other and meet each other. When tensions increased, the heads of the joint military patrols got instructions on both sides not to interact. I was a lecturer in the College for the Training of Military Officers in Israel, and I used to lecture to the Israeli heads of joint patrols. And I would lecture them for an hour, and at the end of my lecture, I'd say, if you forget everything that I told you during this hour, remember one thing. The order that you received not to talk to your counterpart on the Palestinian side, don't listen to it. When you get into trouble, when there's tension, when fighting might erupt between the Israeli and the Palestinian side, your life is going to be dependent on the relationship that you have with the guy in the other jeep. To that extent. Well, when the Second Intifada broke up, all the joint patrols stopped working except in one area, in the area of the north of the West Bank in Jenin. The two commanders of the joint military operations there became very close personal friends. They had even gone on a family vacation to Turkey together with their families. And when the Second Intifada broke out, these two men sat together and said, we're not going to let it happen in our area. And for the first 3 months of the Intifada, the Jenin area was the quietest area of the West Bank. There was no military activity there because of the personal relationship that developed between these two commanders. They were both replaced and kicked out afterwards, and the Jenin became one of the most explosive areas during the Intifada. But as long as that personal relationship was there, they were able to communicate beyond the violence and prevent the violence from coming into their area. So personal relationships are essential. And also ongoing contacts between the leaders. There will always be disputes, there will always be arguments, there will always be difficulties. These ongoing relationships have to be continued and built. And here's an attempt by George W. Bush to do that. Talked about that a little bit. The last thing is, we often forget that building peace is not just signing a peace agreement. Building peace is taking positive, proactive steps to create and develop and foster a culture of peace in your society. You have situations that are coming from a culture of hatred. We breed hatred amongst ourselves and amongst our children to hate the other side, to give them the tools so that they can live in conflict and fight the other side. When you're making peace, you have to reverse everything that you've been doing. Deal with educational systems, textbooks, media, cultural institutions. You need to look at the assets that you have under your control. Grants that you can provide to cultural institutions, universities, scholarships, transferring of teachers, all kinds of trade missions, culture, science. There's a million areas that you can begin to create and foster a culture of peace. It has to be part of a peace process. It has to be conscious. It can't be an afterthought. It has to be built in and integrated. Often peace processes failed because there's so much anti-incitement on each side against the other that you don't develop public support for peace, and the hatred continues. It has to be dealt with. It has to be dealt with early on. It has to be integrated into the peace process. So these are just some of the lessons that I bring to you from my personal experience and the experience of Israelis and Palestinians. Again, I could teach a whole course for a semester on lessons learned from the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, of things that we should do differently. I could bring in other peace processes to give the same examples and other examples. It's really important if you're thinking about becoming mediators. And here I think the most important thing, and I said it twice already, I'll say it one more time. More important than the agreement itself that you're mediating is the day after. Mediation is about giving people the tools of using a different language. Mediation is a language, and language is a culture, and it's about how you deal with disputes when they emerge. And they will continue to emerge, they will continue to develop, and it's not only you being successful at getting people to agree to a document, but providing them with the know-how, the tools, the ability, the culture, and the language to continue on with the process of resolving disputes peacefully. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
So looking at the future of the peace process, as you outlined, there are several focuses that need to be addressed in order for it to be solved, such as settlements, refugees, security borders, etc. Some of us in the Olive Tree Initiative had the chance to go to Washington last summer and talk to Gaith Al-Amari, David Makovsky, which represents one way of thought in terms of how the peace process needs to take place, and then Dennis Ross with his 16-point plan and his belief in confidence-building measures and always going back to the negotiating table. Whereas David Makovsky and Gaith argue that that it's more important to focus on particular issues such as the easier ones and work your way forward. So what would you suggest in building the future of the peace process? Do we need to go back to the negotiating table? Is there a possibility to do that? Or should there be,
Yeah, I think first of all the answer is whatever works. I'm not married to any one particular theory or way of doing things. You have to make the situation, you have to make your solutions appropriate to the situation. I do believe very strongly that you can negotiate peace agreements without sitting at the same table. The best example, the classic example of doing that was what Jimmy Carter did in Camp David I with Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel. Begin and Sadat came from two completely different cultural worlds. They could not speak to each other. There was no chemistry between them. They couldn't communicate anything. They disagreed on everything. What Carter did is he brought them to Camp David, and he had the Egyptian president in one room and the Israeli prime minister in another room, and the American team went back and forth in what's commonly called proximity negotiations. Proximity meaning being close. But the Americans went back and forth between them and negotiated a deal. The other brilliant thing that the Carter team did at Camp David I is that they owned the process and they owned the document, meaning that they did not ask the Israelis and the Palestinians to submit to them documents. The American team drafted the document. It was a single text mediation that got responses from both sides. So the Americans went back and forth between the Egyptians and the Israelis with their version of the text, getting comments from both sides, integrating those comments into the text, and after 26 iterations of this single text, they came up with an agreement. So that's certainly a way of doing the work. George Mitchell, who was the mediator appointed by President Obama, failed miserably because George Mitchell tried to do in Israel and Palestine what he did in Northern Ireland, which was to get all the parties to the same table. And in Northern Ireland it worked, and it was important because Northern Ireland was about process. It wasn't about the substance of the long-term final end results of whether or not Northern Ireland is going to be a part of the Republic of Ireland or part of the United Kingdom. In Northern Ireland, it was how to get these disputing parties to govern together. So there was a process issue, and there it was essential to get the parties into the same room, at the same table, to sit there as long as necessary to hammer out an agreement. Israel and Palestine have had 20 years of process. We don't need more process, we need dealing with the substance. So you can deal with the substance either by bringing them into the room or not bringing them to the room, giving them assignments and having them submit proposals, or you developing proposals. There are all different ways of working on it. If you can get them into the room, the more direct the negotiations are going to be, the better, with the help of a third-party mediator, assistant, bridger. But the more direct negotiations will be in complex issues, the better the situation usually is. But it's not necessary. It's certainly not necessary to begin by having the parties in the room.
If I could just follow up, you suggested dealing with the harder issues such as Jerusalem. How do you propose bringing both parties to come, whether not to a table or to a table, to do that?
Well, if I were the negotiator, I would submit a proposal with several variations to it to both sides to consider. In other words, I would not wait till they make their proposals. I would, because it's been negotiated for so long already, we know what all the issues are, we know what the options are, we know more or less where the lines of agreement and disagreement are. I would, as the third party, come in and begin with an American proposal for dealing with Jerusalem. In fact, what I would do at this point in the game after 19 years of negotiations is I would table a proposal for a full comprehensive agreement. That's how I would start the process and deal with it at that level, because there are trade-offs on the issues. You can't, one of the another lessons learned in these very complex disputes is that it's wrong to negotiate each issue separately. There are interconnections between issues, and you can have trade-offs on the issues to create the pie which is bigger for everyone.
So you would go with the comprehensive
Yes.
approach?
Now, I wouldn't do that at the beginning of the process, but 20 years down the road, that's what I would do. Yeah.
You talked about the idea of constructive ambiguity and how it really hurt the Israeli-Palestinian process. Can you talk about a situation where you think that would be helpful?
Israelis and Palestinians are not going to agree on the Palestinian demand for the right of return for refugees. Palestinians insist that UN Resolution 194 grants Palestinian refugees the right of return. It's a UN General Assembly resolution. The Israelis don't recognize that UN Resolution 194 grants anything called a right of return, and they don't believe that there's a right of return. For Palestinians, the right of return is a holy issue. It's the thread of their identity. It's the core issue in their national collective memory and narrative. And the Palestinian position is that we want Israelis to accept the right of return and to negotiate its implementation. And leaders like President Abbas have said that we understand that very few refugees will actually return to their real homes, but the right of return is not negotiable. Israel will not accept the right of return. So one of the things that Prime Minister Olmert and Abu Mazen tried to do, and I think it's where they were heading and would probably end, is with a constructive ambiguity, where Palestinians would say, we are providing the right of return for 50,000 Palestinians. And the Israelis would say, we are enabling family reunification for 50,000 Palestinian refugees. So each side would be able to claim that we didn't give in on this core issue and have an agreement where the end result is implementable and acceptable. I just made up the number 50,000. Don't quote me on that. But that's the principle.
Okay, it's kind of hard to fit, but I had a question about kind of at what level are these negotiations driven by like the people themselves, and about how much is it like, so after Camp David you had the second intifada, and so even though the leaders agreed on different parameters, there's so much public hatred going on towards each other that even though you accept these parameters, you can't actually implement them.
Yeah.
So like, how much what's the line?
Well, in Israel and Palestine, the situation is the following. You have a majority on both sides of the conflict, in principle, in support of an agreement that everyone knows more or less what the agreement looks like. But at the same time, you have a majority on both sides who don't believe it's possible. We've created and embellished a myth of no partner, so that an overwhelming majority of Israelis and an overwhelming majority of Palestinians believe that we want peace, but we have no one to make it with. So in this kind of situation, the peace process is not going to be driven by the public. The public is afraid. The public is very much wishing to hold on to some kind of status quo where there's no violence and life goes on. Conflict exists, but we're managing the conflict. If we can't resolve it, then let's at least manage it so that people aren't getting killed. That's where the public is. And the role of leaders is to understand that the conflict is resolvable, and it's the job of leaders to do that. They will get the public support afterwards. I always believe anyway it's the job of leaders to shape public opinion and not to follow public opinion. That's what a real leader does. A real leader brings his people or her people with them and shapes public opinion and doesn't become hostage to public opinion.
It just seems difficult for public leaders to, go to make peace when people don't want it as well. So.
Well, if it's clear that the people don't want it, then you have a lot of work to do with your people to convince them that they want it. But I don't know Israelis and I don't know Palestinians who don't want peace. Everyone wants peace. And the question is whether or not you assess it's possible and what the cost of peace is going to be. In my view, both a majority of Israelis and Palestinians are willing to pay the price if they only believed it was possible. So it's the job of the leaders here to prove that it's possible by doing it.
I was reading about impartiality and how important it is for a mediator to not only be impartial as best I can, but the perception of impartiality. But then when you talk about fairness and then you talk about the importance of a mediator being there to make judgments when necessary, and I was wondering what if there are two parties and even if the other party is weaker and allows one party to dominate, then how do you balance being impartial with being fair?
Yeah, I don't believe in impartiality. I don't believe it exists. It doesn't exist in the real world. Maybe it does in a classroom. Mediators' job is to produce a good agreement. And that agreement has to be built on the trust of the parties in the mediator. Palestinians know that the United States is not impartial and have no expectations from the United States to be an impartial mediator in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. But what the Palestinians know is that the Americans are the only mediator that can be effective, because the United States is the only party that can apply pressure on Israel. No one else can. And let's face it, pressure is going to have to be applied on Israel to make certain kind of compromises. So the Palestinians accept the impartiality of the United States as a mediator because they recognize that the United States can be the only effective mediator. When I mediate, I have opinions. And my opinion is important because it will help me get to the best agreement possible. And it's not always impartial. But my goal is not to preserve some sort of sacred, holy impartiality. My job is to help the sides reach the agreement which is going to best serve their interests.
Shefter, they've been learning facilitative style of mediation, where it's all about making sure that the parties reach their agreement in interpersonal relations, and what he's talking about is actually the way it works more in the international arena, and sometimes in the interpersonal. So it's a different style of mediation. It's not wrong, it's not right.
Right, I agree.
For the context.
Yeah.
Going off of the comprehensive style of mediation, and understanding that after several years of things not working out, that's where you kind of use it. I don't know how much you know about the Armenia and Turkey dispute, but that's the other part of the Olive Tree Initiative, which I'm a part of, and I wanted to know what your opinion is on bringing the Azeris in the Turkey-Armenia conflict.
I'm really not an expert on the conflict at all, other than reading the general history that everyone knows, and I've talked to Armenians and Turks about their demands and the enormous difficulty that Turks have in even recognizing that there was a genocide that their ancestors committed against the Armenians. I wouldn't even know where to begin in that dispute because I don't know anything about it. In order to serve as a mediator, what the role of the Azeris might be, I really don't know. What I do know, and this is another argument amongst professionals in the mediation field, is whether or not a mediator needs to be an expert. Can a mediator be a neutral idiot about the issues involved, or does the mediator have to be an expert? I'm particularly in favor of the side of the argument that says the more information and knowledge the mediator has about the issues and the conflict, the better the mediation will be. I don't think that mediators can be effective if they really don't understand the issues. This is why over the years I've developed a completely different type of mediation, which doesn't even really exist in the professional literature. Hopefully someday I'm going to sit down and write the book about it. But what I call it joint stakeholder mediating teams. I think that the most effective mediation possible is when two mediators come who emerge from the conflict, and they work as a team. It's very difficult to do because it's very difficult to get people from the conflict to take on the role of mediator and not be a negotiator on behalf of their side. I ran secret negotiations for the release of the Israeli abducted soldier in Gaza who was held by Hamas for 5.5 years. And I, together with a counterpart in Hamas, became a joint stakeholder mediating team. And he was a senior official in Hamas, and I negotiated a breakthrough that enabled the Israeli government and the Hamas to work out a deal to free the Israeli soldier after 5 years and 4 months in captivity. And that deal would not have been made if it not had been a direct secret back-channel negotiation conducted by the two of us working as a team. And we did exactly what I talked about here, of him putting down his cards and me putting down the cards. I knew what the red lines were of Prime Minister Netanyahu. He knew what the red lines were of the Hamas leadership, of how far they were willing to go. And through that negotiation, working on a document of principles that we shared together. He, in fact, was the primary author of it. It went through 7 iterations before we came to a document of principles that the Prime Minister of Israel gave a green light for, and the Hamas leadership gave a green light for, and that was a breakthrough in the negotiations. In all the years when there were third-party mediators involved in negotiating this prisoner exchange, they failed because all of the third mediators involved had their own interest. And they brought their interest to the table, and they were not able to create a breakthrough. So it was when the joint stakeholder mediators came from the conflict and worked together as a team that we were able to have a breakthrough.